Welcome. We are excited to talk about episode 7. But first, I'd like to point out that John and I are wearing the newly released officially licensed Century Bomber t shirt by 909 Apparel. Their recreation of the iconic Century Bombers emblem was drawn directly from the photos of bomber jackets belonging to veterans of a 100th Bomb Group. 909 Apparel was established in 2019 in the UK and is named in honor of 909, a B-17 built in 1943 that completed 140 combat missions in World War II without loss to the crews that flew her. 50% of the proceeds from these sales will go to the 100th Bomb Group Foundation in support of their historical preservation efforts. So visit 909 Apparel's Amazon store. The link will be pinned in the comments of this show. And we are not sponsored or invited to promote these. We are just doing this because, first of all, these are just really cool shirts.
Yeah.
And we really want to see the 100th Bomb Group succeed in all of their efforts that they've been making to preserve this important history that we're enjoying so much in Masters of the Air. Well, John, I know you and I have talked a little bit off camera, and we both feel that while we have had nothing but praise the last few episodes, we got a few criticisms from this one. So we'll start with that. And that way we can end it on a high note. You want to begin?
Yeah. Gosh. Okay. My overall, and it's not a huge criticism, but it was an overall feeling of the miniseries. And you see a lot of comments on social media was there wasn't much comic relief or even small victories that were being told within the overarching big story. Mm-hmm. And, the two sergeants making it back to base. And, you had the narrator talking about, certain things.
Yeah. Quinn, and I don't remember the name of the other one. The ones, because we saw Quinn get captured. Well, not captured, but given the option to escape or become a prisoner. So that's who the sergeants are.
Oh, yeah. And you had that, wonderful episode that kind of showed the underground, the resistance, the danger and all the mechanisms of how they had to keep stuff, secret from the Gestapo and, of course, the SS. And you have the narrator talking about the base would get electrified from time to time. And, showed the two sergeants riding their bicycles. And I was expecting, I don't know, this big celebration. And kind of I wanted to see a small victory for the men.
At the very least,
stopped it.
At the very least, the story, because I felt like they really set us up. I was expecting a whole storyline of the resistance and helping these men and seeing if they would even get back. Well, all of a sudden, boop, there they are. They're riding their bikes, they're waving, and that's it.
Yes. And as you know more than anybody, because you edited my book, I had a whole chapter on one of my Papaw's buddies getting smuggled back through and, coming and busting into the barracks at 2:00 in the morning. And that was one of my Papaw's favorite, happiest stories. Was that event and of getting a fallen comrade that they just knew was dead, and all of a sudden they're here with them. And I don't know, I just thought the screenwriters just missed a golden opportunity to give us a little comic relief, just a little joy within the overarching story.
Moment in the midst of so much loss and so much death. Because really through the rest of that episode, I think one of the big themes of it was the fact that they were flying these missions, going deeper into Germany, over Berlin, flying the same mission, losing half the crew. You see the replacements coming in and you realize that there's so many dying, that replacements are constantly coming in. So I really think we needed to have that moment. Now, this is a criticism I want to bring in that I think kind of goes along with that. And that is the affair of Crosby and Sandra. First of all, according to his book, and I think that if anybody should have a right to say what he did and didn't do, it's him. According to his book, their relationship was always platonic. So there was nothing to create that relationship out of, except it's just a Hollywood gratuitous sex scene, is how I felt about it. And there is a lot of conversation now in social media post episode 7. A lot of people feel that way. And it's sad because he's kind of this really main figure. He's the narrator. We're connected to him. We've seen him. And now we're all going, Cross, and I feel like it just really weakened the value of this character because people care about fidelity. They actually do, and so
Well, they like their image of their heroes, and Cross
yeah,
set
and
up
and
to be
that's
a
not to say it
hero.
didn't
Yeah,
happen or didn't happen a lot, and maybe that's why they included it, but I don't think that's a part of the story that we all need to focus on when you have a whole escapee story that you've ignored.
yeah.
They coulda used that time, I think, to do something more heroic instead of sort of tearing down a hero to some degree, and so that was definitely something that I felt wasn't necessary and would have been much better left. I feel like there's a story that got left on the cutting room floor
Yeah.
when these men appeared to be a storyline that got dropped, and then something got brought in that I don't believe belonged there. And then that sort of rolls into I think our other criticism, which is just that they are trying to tell stories within 9 episodes that needs probably twice as many or at least a few more to really do justice to the history that they're telling.
Well, and I agree completely that the the Cassandra story on this part. I understand the next episode. We saw the little clip. It's going to show more of what she's
Yeah.
doing and all that. But that storyline just felt like it was stuck in to the
Mhm.
overarching. And I was a little bit more interested in some other storylines. And like I say, and we all know historically that it's factual. That
Mhm.
happened.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
it's one of those things, it just kind of was a downer for me too, also. And I would have loved to have seen an expansion of some of the other storylines. Like you said, it just seemed like it got dropped right then and there. And also,
Mhm.
the narrator gives a little bit talking about why when they came back, because they knew knowledge of the resistance and how they got people smuggled out, that you got shipped back home. And there was a big celebration and stuff. Well,
Yes.
in the book Masters there, there was a lot of emphasis on the underground and how they
Mhm.
smuggled, and there was famous people like Chuck Yeager and that got smuggled back out. And then talked about that same case of once you got smuggled out, the war was over for you, because you couldn't get sent back into combat. Now they might have got sent back to a base or done
Yeah,
some of the
and the
duty.
reason they wouldn't be sent back is because if they were to be captured again,
Yeah,
they had so much knowledge of the resistance, it could have put them at risk, and so they just wouldn't let that happen, and so that was what I love that we have the book because this show is not just about the film
yeah.
or the series, but it's also about the book, and having read it, you're bringing a lot of the missing details to just to the general knowledge of, okay,
Well, I
here's
heard
what
a
we
lot of
saw,
stories
here's
about.
what we saw on screen, and here's what you need to know. Here's the
Yeah.
backstory, or here's what he actually put in the book. Yeah, the resistance was you could do a whole series just on the resistance, and I hope somebody does that
Actually,
someday.
there is one on National Geographic that is primarily on the
Oh,
resistance and all that. So
good.
just started watching that,
Hmm.
and I'm gonna do my
Maybe we'll
second.
have to make that one of our
Yeah,
military movie
yeah.
club shows in the future.
I think it's called A Shining Light. It's on National Geographic,
Mm.
I just started it, so enjoying it so far. But I'm gonna get back to my probably second criticism of this episode, and this is a personal one, just because, like I've told you, I heard so many stories growing up from my papa.
Mhm.
Was the way they introduced the P-51 Mustangs. Okay, they kind of took off and the narrator, all the P-51 and all that. But my granddad, all he talked about was they were waiting for him. They knew they were there, and like he called them, they were the silver angels from heaven, and they were
Yeah.
little buddies. And and I also want to talk about that the
I
one
guess
thing.
that I
Yeah,
guess that criticism will be more next week because
yeah,
we can see that,
with
there's
Tuskegee.
going to
Yeah.
be more. We'll have to see how much attention and time they give to the Tuskegee, but I suspect it's not going to be enough, but simply because they're trying to do so much in such a short period. So,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
and that whole scene, when the P-51 show up, my granddad was talking. He would tell a story about how you'd be sitting there on your mission, and you were waiting for the P-51s to show up to escort you because you had to rendezvous. And you were going, gosh, I hope they show up before the Luftwaffe shows up and stuff. And they would all be looking. Then when they would come, it would be like the cavalry coming. And my granddad was talking about what a beautiful sight it was when they would catch up to you, would engage the enemy. They would drop the extra fuel tanks. And he said it was like a boxer's taking their gloves off. You know, it's time to fight. And they would do this. And my granddad was talking about they would just come flying by and they drop those fuel tanks, and those were the extended fuel tanks underneath the wing. They drop them we're here, big buddy. And they would call them little buddies, and they were big buddies. You know,
I love it. Makes me. Well, we definitely have to watch the Red Tails and do a series on that. But that was quite a scene in this episode, kind of shifting to the positive, that when there's, I don't know how many hundreds of it. They said there's hundreds of the P-51s, and it was just this massive amount of activity going on. All of the what's the word? Not chemtrails, but the streaks that came from these. I don't know what to call it. I don't want to call it chemtrails, but just that was stunning to just kind of get the idea of just how many planes are in the sky so close together at once, and all the fighters were swirling around them while the bombers are flying, and that was just, it wasn't very long, but I thought that was an incredible scene for them to put together.
Yes. So. And, with Rosie talking about the fighters going to punch us through, boys.
Yeah.
And, it was, it was a turning point for the whole 8th Air Force when the P-51 showed up. And my granddad would just talk about it. And I don't know, I was just a little disappointed. I know they got the Red Tail episode coming up, but I was a little disappointed in the narration. And also, my granddad talked, there was a lot of talk in the briefing rooms. They'd go, are the P-51s finally going? It was a big buildup. They knew they were there, and they knew what they could do. And what it changed in the war was you wouldn't have these hour and a half long episodes where you were fighting the Luftwaffe. It was the B-17s versus Luftwaffe. The P-51s, definitely made that a shorter part of the battle. So it was,
just bringing up that picture. This is your grandfather and his crew.
Yes.
On the cover of A Boy from Cracker's Neck. So in our episodes, you refer a lot to this book because there's so many stories that your grandfather told you that I think really allow you to give a lot, sort of that personal first person insight into these bigger scenes. Because we've talked about how this series, the main character is really the 100th group.
Yes.
So we're seeing it from this wider scope. In this episode, we're in 2 locations. In the past, we've been in more locations. We've got Abbott Thorpe, and we've got the prisoner of war camp. But it's so nice when you're able to share, hey, my grandfather had people come back, from escaping and completely surprising them, and what that's like. And so,
and I'll let the viewers know, my grandfather was in the 94th Bomber Group out of Bury St. Edmunds. So, and his time over there was probably around 6 months in timeline behind Masters of the Air. So he would have got there 6 to 8 months after when Masters of the Air first started. So, he saw, his action was mainly in 1944. And
but it was still extremely dangerous. Now, here's a question, and this is towards your grandfather, but also relates to this episode.
Yes.
When your grandfather first went out, was it 25 missions for him, and then it got raised?
Got over there, yes. And I'm glad you brought that up because, my grandfather, he did not think much of the military brass. He didn't think much, and it was mainly over going from. And we saw that in this episode. Then, of course, it went to eventually 35, but by the time they went from 30 to 35, it was a totally different war. And in fact, I talk about in my book how the guys that got over in 45 would hardly ever even see a Luftwaffe, and even the anti-artillery aircraft was very, very little. So they were basically just running missions and with no combat. So it was such a different story. So, and I couldn't imagine. Could you imagine being sitting on, and there was that one character who said, well, that makes it 10 more missions for me and my guys.
Yeah, 8 5
Adding
more for
5.
you, 8 for you, and just
Yeah. We're not
yeah.
making it to 25, and you're making it 30 now?
Yeah, because we had, at the start of the show, we had, I think his last name was Miner, that was the pilot of a
Yes.
crew. They were on their 25th mission, and
Yes.
they didn't make it back. So you see that, and then you watch them raise it, and I think it was really I'm so glad they included that to show that moment where they realize, wow, they really are just here to kill us. And of course, so let's just talk about so one of the highlights of not just this episode, but I'd say the whole series and just in true life is Rosenthal and
Yes.
his heroism. And of course, he goes out on his 25th mission and they make it back.
Yes.
And then he said, yeah, you can go home now. You're done. Even though we're raising it to 30, you get to go. And him coming back in and saying, "Oh, I want to re-enlist." That's just that's the stuff that the best stories are made of. And that's what I love about war history is that you have the greatest stories and they're true.
Yeah.
And for him to just come and re-enlist knowing that he was one of their, if not their best pilot, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't easily be hit with flak or a fighter at any time.
Oh,
So,
he knew that.
yeah.
But in the book, and also, he also talked about why. Okay. Now, I'm not saying he was unpatriotic, but it wasn't over patriotism. It wasn't
Mm.
over being a hero. It was over his connection with fellow
Yes.
airmen.
Yeah.
And over in the book, and my granddad would talk about. My granddad
Mhm.
hung around after he did his combat missions and stuff. It was that survivors. I wouldn't say. I don't know whether you call it survivors' guilt, but they didn't want
I
to
think
leave
that's
their buddies in the fight.
yeah.
And same way with the POWs. They're talking about how we've left our buddies. They're still in the fight, and we're not.
Yeah. I'm sure that had
Yeah.
but you know what? That's still extremely heroic. He was
Yeah, it
sacrificing
is.
himself.
Yeah.
And that's really what I mean, when you talk to veterans, and I work with veterans a lot, it really who they're really fighting for ultimately is the man on either side of them.
Yeah, in the foxhole,
Mm.
in the
Yeah.
infantry, you're fighting for the guy in the foxhole with you.
Yeah.
And
Although, we see I just think some of the best scenes of this episode is Rosenthal. He's greeting the new recruits, doing his best to help them get accustomed to where they are, knowing that they might not be there for long. And he's just got this incredible grace and peace about him. And I have to give the man playing it, I think his name is Nate Mann, that's playing Rosenthal. I think he's done a phenomenal job of representing him. I'm just enjoying watching him. I'm sure he's really recreating how he was at that time. And I just it's very uplifting just to see someone be so courageous.
yes,
And it's really just and that people really live that are like that and have lived that are like that. So,
I'm glad you brought that up on the acting
yeah.
part because he did such a great job. You could tell he was happy he made it 25. He was happy that his crew
Yeah.
made it, but you could also just tell that conflict inside him
Mhm.
going, and also he was conflicted being at the flak house, if you remember. And
Yes.
he was conflicted then going, hey, there's guys flying every day and I'm sitting here in this, luxury accommodations. And he
Yeah.
said, no, we're supposed to be in the fight to the end. And
Yeah, we've watched him just be the quintessential hero the entire time, and it's really who he was.
mhm.
And I think that's beautiful. I wish, like I said, I wish they hadn't put the dark, the shadow over Krause's character in this way because I think he had been that up till this point, and we just kind of have to wipe that from our minds as we go forward. And I think we can do that because we're here to tell the viewers that that's not what was in the book, and it probably didn't happen. So don't judge him too harshly. So let's shift over now to the other location in this episode, which is the prisoner of war camp. And
Yes.
we see it's I think it's a little slower, which is good after all of the air battles. Now we're seeing the men on the ground in the prisoner of war camp and a little bit of what that's like. And we get to see the two bucks together. And it's really interesting to see the contrast between them. They
Yeah.
have
And
such different
you have a lot.
personalities and yet they're such good friends.
And you got a lot more experience with knowing about POW situations than I did. So this is all new to me.
Is
So
it really?
yeah, see, I hadn't read much about it. I hadn't, there hadn't been a whole lot of movies about it. Think about it. You had Stalag 17, you had The Great Escape, but not a
And
lot
they
of
did
yeah,
with The Great Escape. You
yeah,
see it in this episode.
yeah,
They get told what happened. Of course, that creates this feeling like, oh, now things are going to get harder for us, and and I think that was neat. I think it's there. I've seen different reactions to them putting it in, but
uh,
I think it's good that they let it was kind of neat to see it from that side because there is the film The Great Escape with
yeah.
Charles Bronson, and we did a little clip. We did a little episode on Charles Bronson's service to our country that's done very well, and so I think it's neat to see them hear about it and hear about the 50 that were executed and realize that things are about to get harder and maybe escape will be a little harder. But yeah, I know a little bit about it just because I've been sharing, and I have a just a little excerpt to read
Yes, share with
about my great uncle. I'm going to bring up this picture again. So this book, you see the cover on the left, is is a collection of veteran stories that I put together, and there's I can't keep track of how many stories are, and I've edited it a few times. I added some stories, but this man is my great uncle Wiley Hansen, and he was a prisoner of war at a stalag, and his story starts with him being shot down in an earlier episode. I read a little bit of that, and I just want to read a short excerpt from his story. Now, in the show, we get to see the Bucks living in their little barrack. And here's a story from my great uncle's book that kind of lets you get a feel for just what it was like living in those barracks, cramped up together. And he says, "A bed is a wonderful thing. The first night at Stalag Luft was spent on the floor. The next morning, we were looking over the compound, and I found a piece of 6x4 plywood. It became one of my most coveted possessions. Our mattresses were thick weave burlap bags stuffed with excelsior that would work through and fall out on the fellow sleeping below on the bottom bunk. I placed the plywood board under my mattress, and the fellow below me was never troubled with falling excelsior. It's amazing how many different kinds of snores came from our guys. Some were high pitched with whistles. Others were just a low, pleasant, dreamy snore. Mancini had a snore that sounded like an airplane. There goes the Wop on another mission, we would say. Boychuk seemed to have the most trouble flying his bed. Early one morning, the whole barracks was jarred by a thud. Boychuk sat in the corner on the floor, holding his head and sobbing. Thinking he was in a B-17, he had bailed out by jumping from the top of his bunk. He hit the floor head first."
Wow, what a great story.
And that so and his story is full of things that that we're seeing in the show, which is kind of nice because it's it's sort of like testifying to what he's shared. He talks about walking in the stalag the first time, which is that powerful scene where we saw Buck and Bucky meet each other. And he talks about what it was like, and it was just the same thing. Everybody was excited. They were running to the fence and asking questions and wanting to hear news from the people just arriving. But he does describe them, and I think the description of what they look like is a little different than the show. And he said they were wearing all kinds of uniforms. You had American airmen in Russian uniforms, and their hair, some of them were as long as girls because they'd been there so long. So they weren't quite as clean cut as what we saw, at least at the time that my great uncle arrived at a Luftstalag. But it's just interesting to read his story and to watch the show. So I hope y'all don't mind that I've been sharing little excerpts from him.
Oh, great story. Another thing I want to point out for the viewers, and someone might add in some comments about that, how important that scene was when the German official talked about the Luftwaffe running the POW camps versus the potential of the Gestapo or the SS running it.
Mm-hmm.
And at that particular time, I did a few Google searches. I couldn't come up with exact numbers, but when the United States entered the war, Great Britain shipped 175,000 POWs to America. And most of those were German airmen. Same thing was happening to Germany that was happening to us. When they were bailing out and landing in England, they were getting, put in POW camps. So the Luftwaffe in Germany, it was that understanding, well, if you take care of ours, we'll take care of yours. And that was that comment about, well, they took care of us probably the best they could, and all that. One thing in the book, the book goes into a lot more detail about POW life. And I actually grew up and knew a POW in our neighborhood that would come by and talk to my granddad on many occasions. The biggest thing they dealt with was one, boredom, and the health thing. The health thing, John Egan talks about the health, but also just the uncertainty from day to day living. From most overall, they followed rules, but all it took was bad news from a couple of the guards. Their family got bombed or something bad happened to them, and then you'd see somebody get shot. So and his name was Ed. He would come by. He was a POW. He was just talking about that stress of you never knew what that day held, and you also didn't know how long you were going to be there. That's why I hope the viewers could understand how important news was. How's the war going?
Yeah, and you see Bucky, Buck. Well, Bucky helps Buck.
Yes.
By procuring the materials he needed to build a crystal radio, because the guards had tossed their barrack and found their radio, but not their headset, which I think means that they didn't know what they found. They didn't know it was a radio. If they'd found the headset, they'd probably gotten a lot more trouble than they didn't seem to get into any trouble, which is a good thing. So then Bucky builds a radio, and at first it doesn't work, but eventually figures out how to make it work. And you see how important it was to them just to be able to get the news that was sent out over the radio waves, to get some idea of how things were going. And I know in my uncle's book, they did something similar, except what they had done is they actually built a light socket in a similar fashion, just, scrounging up cardboard and wires. And because it was so dark, they were allowed to read, but it was so dark, it hurt their eyes. And so they built a light socket and procured a 60-watt bulb. Yeah. So I watched that and I'm like, yeah, that's, it's amazing the ingenuity of the things they did. And of course, the other thing you see in the show is that, and I don't know how often this would have happened, but they were catching cats to become
there's a lot of cat lovers in my family. They're not going to like that scene, and of course I'm allergic to cats, so it didn't bother me nearly as bad. But anyway, and talk about meat. Their diet, health was a thing. They got treated by the Geneva Conventions early in the war. And then, of course, as the war went south for Germany, you can imagine their conditions got worse and worse. And also the Red Cross. That was another storyline we're not going to see that intrigued me. Was imagine being a Red Cross worker, going to these camps, seeing what they're doing, and see, be an interesting storyline to research.
It's war, but I talk about working with veterans, and the veterans I work with are prisoners. The incarceration rate of our veterans, we finally are talking about the suicide rate, 23 a day, but the incarceration rate is really high. And that's something we don't talk a lot about. And I bring that up because watching the show, this is prisoner of war, right? So, we're seeing them be treated harshly. Going into the prisons, I'm going to tell you, our prisons are not much better. I just want to point that out for a moment, because I really feel like our society is at the very least, we're apathetic to the plight of those who are in our prisons. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Really, we incarcerate our citizens, and our veterans, they only make up 1% to 2% of our population, and they make up 5% of the state prison. It was higher than that. It was close to 10%. Wow. And 8% of the federal prisons. So 1 in 3 veterans is incarcerated. Is justice involved, not incarcerated. Probably, been to jail to be justice involved. That's a very high, 1 in 3.
Quick question, just off the hip. How much would you think is PTSD related, mental health related?
I think to be honest, I think when it comes to prison, most of the people in prison are there because of PTSD or trauma,
mental health, and mental health.
Yeah, we don't provide good mental health support. I think nobody would argue with that. that in our country we don't help people like we should.
Oh,
We definitely don't help our veterans. And so most of them have serious mental health problems, and we just put them in prison. What I'm trying to say is, watching that show, they're getting their barracks tossed, they're lining them up, they're treating them inhumanely. That's how we treat prisoners. And I really believe that we've got to fix that system and help people and rehabilitate them, give them the help they didn't get. If you're going to lock them up, fine. I get it. They're dangerous,
there has to be a point,
but help them. Don't treat them like prisoners of war.
Yeah.
And having been inside, and maybe this will get me in trouble with but I just think we can do better. We can do so much better. And so yeah, it was kind of hard to watch that. And even the cats being in the, on the property, there's so many cats in prisons. Like they just, they're, of course they're all strays, and there's none of them are fixed. And so yeah, I'm sure that happened. Some people are like, well, how did a cat get in when they can't get out? Well, they get in.
Your cats can get in.
Yeah. I think another thing we should point out, and we're getting towards the end of our time, but we see towards the end, we see the prison leadership bring in, the leadership among the prisoners, and let them know they want to find all the Jewish airmen.
Great quote, great quote.
Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and let you say what is his response to
We're
that?
all Americans here at Stalag.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great quote. We're all Americans.
It's really important. So I think that's a good point to end on for this week. And we've got 2 left.
Yes.
This has really been enjoyable for those that are watching. We will be starting a series called Military Movie Club. So we're going to continue this, but we'll just be talking about other films. There's a lot of great military movies that are coming out brand new on some of these streaming channels. And so we'll be announcing. If you want to know what movie we're watching, just go to our Facebook page, or go to, which is Masters of the Air Talks, obviously, or go to mastersoftheairtalks.com, which will take us to the website where you can subscribe to get the schedule of the shows that we'll be watching. So any final thoughts?
No, look forward to next week.
Me too. All right. Thanks, everybody.